Hello, everyone. Hi, how y'all doing? Janae's here. I'm here today. I'm going to be studying Congress. This is from my um, American Government book and Politics Today, so a college course that I'm taking. I have less than an hour to study, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to read as much as I can. This video is probably going to be 45 minutes. So if you're not here the whole time, I totally understand. I'm doing this so that I can practice reading aloud and getting more comfortable. And so I can kind of be held accountable by making these videos. It's definitely helpful, I believe. So there's going to be words that I'm not familiar with, new words that I'm going to learn. Some I may not know how to pronounce. And so I may need to use my phone device in order to figure out how to actually pronounce the word or maybe even define its meaning. Sometimes definitions I don't know aren't located in the book, and so I have to get the information from another source. So I'll be using my cell phone. But I am definitely going to get started. Again, this video is going to be longer than 25 minutes. So it's going to be probably about 45 minutes. So I'm just going to read. I'm going to try not to stop to talk so much. I'm going to test it out to see if that's helpful for me to just keep reading or if it's more helpful to stop and to try to brainstorm and like reflect on what the paragraph was about. But I'm going to start with background information. So it just kind of gets you into it. I don't really want to start there, but I'll start there. So the background. So the first year of the first Congress, held from 1789 to 1791, members met from March to September, passing necessary legislation and organizing the government. The next year, they met from January to August and then reconvened from December to from December to March. During the next 5 decades, Congress conducted most of its business in short sessions, with long recess periods for the members to maintain their farms and businesses back home. Today, the U.S. Congress is still organized as 2 one-year sessions. The respective houses adjourn at the very end of 1 year and then reconvene about 3 weeks later. The House calendar designates the days that members can spend in district meetings with constituents and, in many cases, fundraising. Currently, the House works more full weeks than in the past, but it has also given itself more days at home for district work. Today's House and Senate do not want to adjourn formally because they fear the executive branch will take action while they are not in session. This work pattern allows the difficult issues, such as raising the debt ceiling, to go unresolved for many months. Other measures, such as tax relief and or the extension of unemployment benefits, may persist for short periods with no attempt to resolve underlying issues. Congress may pass its own procedure, avoid such unpleasant tasks as finalizing a fiscal year budget. The government can run on a series of continuing resolutions. The low 2018 public approval rating of Congress, along with the recent lack of congressional productivity, might make one wonder about an admittedly radical idea. What if Congress had time limits? In contrast to Congress, many state constitutions limit the days and weeks that state legislators can meet. The Kentucky legislature may only meet for 60 legislative days in even number years and 30 days in odd numbered years. In Nevada, the legislature may meet for 120 calendar days. In Missouri, the legislature must conclude its business by March 30th. Additionally, most state constituents require that the state budget must be balanced and the government cannot continue without a budget for the fiscal year. In some states, if the legislator does not complete the work on a budget, the governor may complete the task. If the U.S. Congress were limited by the constitutional amendment to meeting for only 6 months, could the body be effective? 6 months to work, followed by 6 months to be in one's home state, would increase the pressure to complete the year's business, including the budget and tax issues. Before adjournment, both political parties might feel pressure to compromise and pass legislation before going home to explain their votes to their constituents. Given the large number of work to do, members could easily spend as much time in daily floor sessions as they do now. Communication with their constituents back home could be handled by live conferences over the internet. Depending on the wording of the amendment, it would be possible to consider membership in the House or Senate a part-time job, as in many state legislators. This would mean perhaps paying the members a part-time or reduced salary, expecting them to maintain a career in the working world. That change alone would make individuals less likely to see election to Congress as a career. Congress might return to a legislature of citizen legislators, much as the founders envisioned. The expenses of supporting the Congress could be greatly decreased because the large amount of staff on Capitol Hill would no longer be necessary, and Congressperson would be consistently traveling back and forth to Washington. Disadvantages of part-time Congress. Obviously, a part-time Congress would have little ability to deal with the domestic or international crisis. In the states, the governor has the ability to call the legislator back to the Capitol in special session. The president can also call Congress into special session to deal with emergencies. Would make membership a part-time job costs the body in terms of expertise and effectiveness. Would making membership a part-time job cost the body in terms of expertise and effectiveness? Scholars who have studied the effects of term limits on state legislators say that having more frequent turnovers of members reduce the knowledge available to make good decisions. It takes several years for a member of Congress to become well-versed in public policy in any one specific area or to understand the budget, say, of the Department of Defense. Making their jobs part-time would make it harder to gain the expertise necessary to offset the expertise of either bureaucrats or lobbyists for special interests. Both of these groups would still be engaged in fighting for their interests full-time. The executive would likely gain power if Congress worked only 6 months a year. The president would be free to make more interim appointments without congressional scrutiny and to dominate the media with his or her agenda. Members of the Congress would be playing catch up when they return to Washington after 6 months at home. Most Americans view Congress in a less flattering light. In recent years, Congress has appeared to be deeply split, highly partisan in its conduct, and not very responsive to public needs. Polls show that public approval has fallen to record lows. Yet individual members of Congress often receive much higher approval ratings from the voter in their districts. This is one of the paradoxes of the relationship between the people and Congress. Members of the public hold the institution in relatively low regard compared with the satisfaction they express with their individual representatives. Part of the explanation for these seemingly contradictory appraisals is that congresspersons spend considerable time and effort serving their constituents. If the federal bureaucracy makes a mistake, the senator or representative's office tries to resolve the issue. Members of Congress spend considerable time and effort developing what is sometimes called a home style to gain the trust and appreciation of their constituents through service, low appearances, and the creation of local offices. Congress, however, was also created to work for the nation as a whole. The representatives and senators in the Washington are creating what might be called a Hill style, which refers to the work or on legislation and in party leadership to create laws and policies for our nation. This chapter describes the function of Congress, including constituent service, representation, lawmaking, and oversight of the government, how the members of Congress are elected, how Congress organizes itself when it meets, and how bills pass through the legislative process. The functions of Congress. The functions of Congress. America's founders believed that the bulk of the power to be exercised by a national government should be in the hands of the legislator, because the members who were elected by the people, or in the case of a Senate, by the states. The leading role and vision for Congress is apparent from its primacy in the Constitution. Article 1 deals with the structure, the powers, and the operation of Congress, beginning in Section 1 with an application of the basic principle of separation of powers. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. The legislative powers are spelled out in detail in Article 1 and elsewhere. The bicameralism of Congress, its division into two legislative houses, was in part the result of the Connecticut Compromise, which tried to balance the large state population advantage reflected in the House and the small state demand for quality and policy making satisfied in the Senate. Beyond that, the two chambers of Congress also reflected the social class biases of the founders. They wished to balance the interests and the numerical superiority of the common citizen with the property interest of the less numerous landowners, bankers, and merchants. They achieved this by providing in Section 2 and 3 and Article 1 that members of the House of Representatives should be elected directly by the people, whereas members of the Senate were to be chosen by the elected representatives sitting in state legislatures, who were more likely to be members of the elite. In 1913, the passage of the 17th Amendment, which provides that senators also are to be elected directly by the people, resulted in the change of the latter provision. The logic of separate constituencies and separate interests underlining the bicameral Congress was reinforced by differences in length of tenure. Members of the House are required to face the electorate every 2 years, whereas senators can serve for a much more secure term of 6 years, even larger than the 4-term provided for the president. Furthermore, the senators' terms are staggered so that only 1/3 of the senator face the electorate every 2 years, along with all the House members. The bicameral structure of Congress was designed to enable the legislative body and its members to perform certain functions for the political system. These functions, including lawmaking, representation, service of constituents, oversight, public education, and conflict resolution. Of these, the two most important and one most often in conflict are lawmaking and representation. The lawmaking function. The most obvious function of the legislator is lawmaking. Congress is the highest elected body in the country, charged with making binding rules for all Americans. Lawmaking requires decisions about size of the federal budget, health care reform and gun control, and the long-term prospect of war or peace. A majority of the bills that Congress acts on orientate in the executive branch, and many other bills are traceable in interest groups and political party organizations. Through the process of compromise and log rolling, offering to support a fellow member's bill in exchange for that member's promise to support your bill in the future, as well as debate and decisions, backers and legislation attempts to fashion a winning majority coalition to create policies for the nation. The representation function. Representation, including both representing and desires and demands of the constituents in the member's home district or state, and representing large national interests such as farmers or the environment. Because the interests of constituents in a specific district may be in conflict with the demands of national policy, the representation function is often at variance with the lawmaking functions for individual lawmakers and sometimes for Congress as a whole. Although it may be in the interest of the nation to reduce defense spending by closing military bases, such closures are not in interest of the states and districts that will lose jobs and local spending. Every legislator faces votes that set representational issues against lawmaking realities. How should the legislators fulfill the representation function? There are several views on how this should be accomplished. The trustee view of representation. The first approach to question of how representation should be achieved is that legislators should act as trustees of the broad interests of the entire society. They should vote against the narrow interests of constituents if their conscience and their perceptions of the national needs so dictate. The instructed delegate view of representation. Directly opposed to the trustee view of representation is the notion that the members of Congress should behave as instructed delegates. That is, they should mirror the views of the majority of the constituents who elected them to power in the first place. On the surface, this approach is plausible and rewarding. For it to work, however, we must assume that constituents actually have well-formed views of the issues that are directed in Congress, and further, that they have a clear-cut preference about these issues. Neither condition is likely to be satisfied very often. Generally, most legislators hold neither a pure trustee view nor a pure instructed delegate view. Typically, they combine both perspectives in a pragmatic mix that is often called the politico style. Political style. Politico. Political style. Service to constituents. Individual members of Congress are expected to act as broker between private citizen and often faceless federal government. This function usually takes the form of casework. Legislators make choices about their heel style, deciding how much time they and their staff will spend in casework activities, such as tracking down a missing Social Security check, explaining the meaning of particular bills to people who may be affected by them, promoting a local business interest, or interceding with a regulatory agency on promoting a local business interest, or interceding with the regulatory agency on behalf of the constituents with disagree with proposed agency regulations. Legislators and many analysis of congressional behavior regard this ombudsperson role as an activity that strongly benefits the members of Congress. A government characterized by a large confusion bureaucracy and complex public program offers innumerable opportunities for legislators to assist usually grateful constituents. Morris P. Fiorina once suggested somewhat mischievously that senators and representatives prefer to maintain bureaucratic confessions to maximize their priorities for performing good deeds on behalf of the constituents. Some poor aggrieved constituents became enmeshed in the tentacles of the evil bureaucracy and calls upon Congressman St. George to do battle with the dragon. The constituent who receives aid believes that the congressman and the congressman alone got results. Although the political parties in Congress disagree on most issues, they find it difficult to vote against benefits for their constituents. As the 2008 recession continued, the administration proposed a reduction in the percentage of wage withheld from workers' paycheck for Social Security as a way to put more money in their pockets. Although the Republicans pointed out the long-term consequence of the plan, setting even less money aside for Social Security, they could not vote against the tax cut. Democrats spoke to the benefit of this temporary action for ordinary workers. Both parties choose to ignore the fact that this action makes it likely that Social Security will be insolvent even earlier than it has been predicted. Senators and representatives increasingly see their oversight function as a critically important part of their legislative activities. In part, oversight is related to the concept of constituency service, particularly when Congress investigates alleged arbitrariness or wrongdoing by the bureaucratic agency. The public education function. Educating the public is a function that is performed whenever Congress holds public hearings, exercise oversight over the bureaucracy, or engages in the committee and floor debate on such major issue and topics as political assassination, aging, illegal drugs, and the concern of small businesses. In doing so, Congress presents a range of viewpoints on pressing national questions. In recent years, members of Congress and the Committee of the Congress have greatly improved access to information through the use of the internet. Congress also decides what issues will come up for discussion and decision. This decision setting is a major facet of its public education function. The conflict resolution function. Congress is commonly seen as an institution for resolving conflicts within American society. Organized interest groups and representatives of different racial, religious, economic, and ideological interests view Congress as an access point for airing the grievances and seeking help. This puts Congress in a position of trying to resolve the differences among the competing points and viewpoints by passing laws to accommodate as many interest parties as possible. To the extent that Congress meet the pluralist expectations in accommodating competing interests, it tends to build support for the entire political process. The power of Congress. Describe the major powers of the Congress as granted by the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution is both highly specific and extremely vague about the powers that Congress may exercise. The first 17 clause of Article 1, Section 8 specifies many of the enumerated powers of Congress, powers expressly given to that body. Enumerated powers. Enumerated powers is specifically granted to the national government by the Constitution. The first 17 clauses of Article 1, Section 8 specify most of the enumerated powers of Congress. The enumerated powers of Congress include the right to impose taxes and import tariffs, borrow funds, regulate interstate commerce and international trade, establish procedures for naturalizing citizens, make law regulating bankruptcies, coin and print money, and to regulate its value, establish standards of weight and measures, punish counterfeiters, establish post offices and postal routes, regulate copyright and patents, establish the federal court system, publish illegal acts on high seas, declare war, rise and regulate an army and a navy, call up and regulate the state militias to enforce laws, to suppress insurrections and to repeal invasions, and govern the District of Columbia. The most important of the domestic powers of Congress listed in Article 1, Section 8 are the rights to collect taxes, to spend, and to regulate commerce. The most important foreign policy power is the power to declare war. Other sections of the Constitution allow Congress to establish rules for its own members, to regulate the Electoral College, and to override the presidential veto. Congress may also regulate the extent of the Supreme Court's authority. Review cases decided by the lower courts, regulate relations among states, and propose amendments to the Constitution. Powers of the Senate. Some functions are restricted to the chamber. The Senate must advise on and consent to the ratification of trustees and must accept or reject presidential nominations of ambassadors, Supreme Court justice, and all other officers of the United States. During the President Obama's first term, 2 Supreme Court vacancies occurred through the retirements of Justice David Souter in 2009 and John Paul Stevens in 2010. The president nominated appellate Judge Sonia Sotomayor and to fill the Souter's seat in 2009. Although the Republicans in the Senate would have liked to object to the appointment of Judge Sotomayor had been confirmed in her appellate seat as an appointee of George W. Bush. In 2010, President Obama made another somewhat controversial appointment, but given the outstanding qualification of Solicitor General Elaine Kagan, she too was confirmed. When the Supreme Court, Antonin Scalia, died suddenly in 2016, President Obama announced his intention to fill that seat, although Republican senators claimed that they would not even hold a hearing on a nominee until after the presidential election. Holding firm on this decision, Republicans in the Senate hope for a Republican president and a Republican-controlled Senate after the 2016 election. With the victory of Donald Trump, they look forward to his nominee to the court shortly after his inauguration in January. Although the Republicans in the Senate slowed the approval process for lower court judges in the first year of the Obama presidency, eventually the majority of his judicial appointments were approved. Republicans in the Senate were particularly angered by the president's decision to make recess appointments to the National Labor Relations Board and the new Consumer Protection Agency during the Christmas holiday in 2011. To prevent such appointments, the Senate did not recess but held symbolic sessions for a few moments each day. When the federal appeal courts refused to stop the appointments to the National Labor Relations Board, members of the Senate appealed the case to the Supreme Court in 2014. In a unanimous opinion, the Supreme Court found the president's actions unconstitutional, stating that only the Senate can decide when it is in recess. Constitutional amendments. Amendment to the Constitution provides additional power. Congress must certify the election of the president and vice president or choose the officers if no candidate has a majority of the electorate votes. 12th Amendment. It may levy an income tax, 16th Amendment, and determine who will be acting president in case of a death or incapacity of the president or vice president. 20th Amendment and 25th Amendment. The necessary and proper clause. Congress enjoys the right under the Article 1, Section 8, the elastic or the necessary or proper clause, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers of Article 1 and all other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States or in any document or officer thereof. This vague statement of congressional responsibilities provided over time the basis for a greatly expanded national government. It also constituted, at least in theory, a check on the expansion of presidential powers. Check on Congress. When you consider all the powers of Congress and its ability to override the presidential veto, it is undoubtedly the most powerful branch of government. However, given the diversity of interests in the nation, rarely can Congress agree to override a presidential veto. So, one check on Congress is the veto of the president. Another constitutional check is the power of the Supreme Court to hold a law passed by Congress as unconstitutional. Additionally, the member of the House face election every 2 years. If Congress were to exercise too much power, it is likely that many members would be vetoed out of office. And on the other side of the Capitol Hill sits the Senate, which often curbs the House by not agreeing with proposal from the other House. House-Senate differences. Explain the differences between the House of Representatives and the Senate with regard of their constituencies, terms of office, powers, and political processes. Congress is composed of two markedly different but co-equal chambers. Although the Senate and the House of Representatives exist within the same legislative institution, each has developed certain distinctive characteristics that clearly distinguish it from the other. Table 11.1 summarizes these differences. So it says the differences between the House and the Senate, the House and the Senate. So for the House, the constitutional difference is members from the local district, 2-year term, originally elected by voters, may impeach, indict federal officials. For the Senate, members must choose from the entire state, a 6-year term, originally 1913, elected by the state legislators, may convict federal officials, impeach offenses. For the House, larger 435 voting members, more formal rules, debate limited, less prestige and less individual notice, more partisan. For the Senate, smaller 100 members, fewer rules and restrictions, debate extended, more prestige and more media attention, more individualistic. For the House, originates bills for raising revenues. For the Senate, has power to advise the president on and to consent to presidential appointments and treaties. Size and rules. The central difference between the House and the Senate is simply that the House is much larger than the Senate. The House has 435 representatives plus delegates from the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, and Virginia Island. The Senate has 100 members. The size difference means that the greater the number of formal rules are needed to govern the activity of the House, whereas looser procedures can be observed in the less crowded Senate. The effect of the difference in size is most obvious in the rules governing debate on the floors of the two chambers. The House employs an elaborate system to control the agenda and allot time fairly in such a large assembly. For each major bill, the Rule Committee normally possesses a rule for debate that includes time limitation, divides the time between the majority, and specifies whether amendments can be proposed. The House debates and approves the rule, which will govern the debate on that specific legislation. As a consequence of its stricter time limits on debate, the House, despite its greater size, often is able to act on the legislation more quickly than the Senate. So the rule is a standing committee of the House of Representatives that provides special rules under which specific bills can be debated, amended, and considered by the House. Debating and filibustering. In the Senate, the rules governing debate are much less restrictive. In fact, the legislation to react the floor on the Senate, the body must have approved the rules of the debate by the unanimous consent agreement. The entire body agrees to the rules of the debate. The Senate tradition of the filibuster, or the use of the unlimited debate as a blocking tactic, dates back to 1790, when the proposal to move the U.S. Capitol from New York to Philadelphia was stalled by such time-wasting maneuver. This ultimate debate tradition, which also existed in the House until 1811, is hardly absolute. Under Senate Rule 22, debate may be ended by evoking cloture. Cloture shuts off discussion on a bill. Amended in 1975 and 1979, Rule 22 states that debate may be closed off on a bill if 16 senators signs a petition questioning it, and if another 2 days have elapsed. 3/5 of the entire membership's 60 votes, assuming no vacancies, vote for cloture. After cloture is invoked, each Senate may speak on a bill for a maximum of 1 hour before the vote is taken. Beginning in 2009, the use of the filibuster became a usual way of doing business in the Senate. At the beginning of the session, the Democratic Party, plus the 2 independent senators, Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Joe Lieberman of Connecticut, could muster 60 votes to support President Obama's innovatives in healthcare reform and financial reform. Republican filibuster many votes, but failed to stop the legislation. Beginning in 2013, Republicans control 45 seats, rendering their threat of the filibuster even more effective. The Democratic majority in the Senate used a parliamentary tactic to bring a change to the filibuster rule up for a vote. This nuclear option allowed a simple majority to charge the filibuster rule. The amended rule does not allow the filibuster against any executive or judicial appointments except for the Supreme Court nominees. After the vote, the Republican warned Democrats that they will not always hold a majority in the Senate, and rule will be used against them in the future. The use of such tactics has increased tremendously over the 2 decades, leading to the concept of unorthodox lawmaking, meaning the use of obscure parliamentary procedures to get laws passed in the face of strong opposition. Such tactics, however, are difficult to explain to the public and certainly undercut trust in the legislative process. Prestige. As a consequence of the greater size of the House of Representatives, cannot achieve as much individual recognition as public prestige as can members of the Senate. Senators can readily gain media exposure and establish careers as spokesperson for large national constituencies. For the House and member to become nationally known, he or she must be a member of the leadership or become a recognized expert on the specific policy. Congressperson and the citizenry, a comparison. Members of Congress are not typical American citizens. They are older than most Americans, partly because of constitutional age requirements and partly because of good deal of political experience normally is an advantage in running for national office. They are also disproportionately white, male, and trained in high status occupations. Lawyers are by far the largest occupational group among congresspersons. Although the proportion of lawyers in the House is lower than it was in the past, compared with the average American citizen, members of Congress are well paid. In 2016, annual congressional salaries were $174,000. For the last 8 years, members of Congress have vetoed not to accept an automatic increase scheduled for January 1st of the year. Increasingly, members of Congress are also much wealthier than the average citizen, whereas less than 1% of American assets exceeding $1 million, half of the members of Congress are millionaires. Table 11.2 summarizes selected characteristics of the members of Congress. Age average, 38.8. House, 57.8. Senate, 61.8. Percent minority, 38%. House, 24%. Senate, 11%. Religion. Percent churchgoers, 74%. House, 98%. Senate, 97%. Percent Catholic, 21%. 33% for House, 24% Senate. Percent Protestant, 48%. House, 55%. Senate, 58%. Percent Jewish, U.S. population, 2%. House, 5%. Senate, 8%. Gender, percent male, U.S. population, 2018, 51%. House, 20%. Senate, 23%. Lawyers, U.S. population, 0.4%. House, 39%. Senate, 50%. Blue collar occupation, U.S. population, 2018, 30%. House, 9%. Senate, 6%. Military veteran reserves, U.S. population 2018, 7.6%. House, 18%. Senate, 19%. Percentage household earning more than $50,000. U.S. population 2018, 42%. House, 100%. Senate, 100%. Assets more than $1 million. U.S. population 2018, 1%. House, 52%. Senate, 70%. Compared with the composition of Congress over the past 200 years, however, the House and Senate are significantly more diverse in gender and ethnicity than ever before. In the 115th Congress, 2017 to 2019, there were 88 women in the House of Representatives, 20%, and 23 women in the seat in the House. They included 48 African American members, 41 Latino or Hispanic members, 15 Asians or Pacific Islander Americans, and 2 Native Americans. The Senate has 3/5 African American members, 5 Hispanic. The Senate has 3 African American members, 5 Hispanic members, and 3 Asian American members. The 115th Congress had significant numbers and members born in 1946 or later. the so-called baby boomers, the American of the House members and the Senate, belong to this post-war generation. This shift in the character of Congress may prompt consideration of the issues that will affect boomers, such as Social Security and Medicare. Congressional elections. Congressional elections are conducted by the individual state governments, but the state must confirm the rules established by the U.S. Constitution and by the national status. Representatives are to be elected every second year by popular ballot, and the number of seats awarded to each state is to be determined every 10 years by the result of the census. The decennial census is viewed by members of Congress and by the states. If the census is not accurate, perhaps undercounting individuals living in the state, that the state might lose a representative in Congress. Each state has at least one representative, with most congressional districts having about 650,000 residents. Senators are elected by popular vote, the 17th Amendment. Every 6 years, approximately 1/3 of the seats are chosen every 2 years. Each state has 2 senators. Only states can elect members of Congress. Therefore, territories such as Puerto Rico and Guam are not represented. Although they do elect non-voting delegates who sit in the House, the District of Columbia also represented only by a non-voting delegate, but it's not represented by the Senate at all. Several proposals have been made to grant the congressional representation to our nation's capital. In 1978, Congress approved a constitutional amendment to give the District of Columbia the representation it would have if it were a state, including 2 senators. The amendment was not ratified. However, Democrats in Congress have generally supported representation for the district because the majority of the citizens are African American and vote overwhelmingly Democratic. Republicans opposed the initiative for the same reason. Candidates for the congressional election. Candidates for the House and Senate seats may be self-selected. Members of the House may be at least 25 years old, a citizen for 7 years, and live in the state they will represent. Senators must be 30 years old, a citizen for 9 years, and a resident of the House they represent. In congressional districts where one party is very strong, however, there may be a shortage candidate willing to represent the weaker party. Leaders of the weaker party must often recruit candidates. Candidates may resemble the voters of the district in ethnicity or religion, but are also likely to be very successful individuals previously active in politics. House candidates are especially likely to have local ties to their district. Candidates usually choose to run because they believe they would enjoy the job and its accompanying status. They also may be thinking of the House seat as a stepping stone for the future political office as a senator, governor, or president. Individuals who seek Senate seats may also have to plan to run for governor in their home states or be considering a run for presidency. Congressional campaigns and elections. Congressional campaigns have changed considerably in the past 2 decades. Like all other campaigns, they are much more expensive. Today, the average cost of a winning Senate campaign is $10.5 million. A winning House campaign costs more than $1.7 million. Campaign funds, including direct contributions by individuals, contributing by politic action committees, PACs, and soft money funneled through the state party committee. All of these contributions are regulated by laws including the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971 as amended, and most recently, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002. Most candidates for Congress must win a nomination through a direct primary in which party identifiers vote for the candidate who will be on the party ticket in the general election. To win the primary, candidates must take more liberal and more conservative positions to get the votes of the party identifiers. In the general election, they may moderate their views to attract the views or votes of independents and voters from their other party. Presidential effects. Congressional candidates always hope that a strong presidential candidate will have coattails, that they will sweep in the senator and representative of the same party. Coattail effect have been quite limited and in recent presidential elections have not materialized at all. One way to measure a coattail effect is to look at the subsequent midterm election held in an even number of years. Following the presidential contest, voters' turnout falls sharply. In the past, the part controlling the White House normally lost seats in the Congress in the midterm elections, in part because the coattail effect ceased to apply. Members of the Congress who were from contested districts or who were in their first term, were more likely not to be reelected. Table 11.3 shows the pattern of the midterm election since 1942. The party's presidential party lost seats in every election from 1942 to 1988. In that year, the President Clinton, under the threat of impeachment, voters showed displeasure with the Republicans by voting in 5 more Democrats. In 2002, Republicans bucked the normal slump of winning 5 more Republican seats in the House. Most commentators believe that these midterm victories were based on the public support for the president after the September 11, 2001 attack. In 2006, the President Republic suffered a fairly normal midterm defeat comparable to the midterm defeat in 1958 during the Eisenhower presidency. In 2010, midterm elections were a sweeping win by the Republicans, aided by the newly energized Tea Party movement. Republicans gained more than 60 seats in the House of Representatives, thus gaining majority control in the body. Although it is normal for the out party to gain seats in the midterm sides, the size of the Republican victories was the largest even in modern times. The midterm election of 2008 saw a reversal of the Republicans' fortunes. Although President Trump campaign had hard across the country, his influence was felt only in the Senate races, where Republicans kept the majority. In the House, Republicans lost more than 30 seats and their majority. The president faced a divided Congress in 2019. The power of incumbency. The power of incumbency in the outcome of congressional elections cannot be overemphasized. Once members are elected to survive the second election, they build considerable loyalty among the constituents and are frequently reelected as long as they wish to serve. Table 11.4 shows that more than 90% of representatives and a slightly smaller proportion of senators who run for re-election are successful. Several scholars contend that the pursuit of the re-election is the strongest motivation behind the activities of Congress, members of Congress. Incumbents develop their home style using the mass media, making personal appearances with constituents, and sending newsletters, all the procedures a favorable image and to make their name and household word. Members of the Congress present themselves as informed, experienced, and responsive to the Congress present to their district needs. Incumbents can demonstrate the position that they have taken on key issues by referring to their voting records in Congress. So I'm going to stop right here only because I have to get going to work. I need to be to work by 1:30, so it's almost 1 o'clock, and it takes me like 30 minutes to get there. So I'm going to end the video right here, and then I'll just have to pick this back up later to finish off. So I still have quite a few pages remaining. So it looks like it stops at 417, and I'm almost at 400. So 18 more pages. So it's not too much more. But thank y'all for y'all time. Hopefully y'all learned something. Thanks for studying with me. Ciao.